Chapter 2. "I thought you were a railroad man for life," Kyle said to Radford as he hopped onto the back of Evelyn's wagon. Radford lifted Rebecca onto his lap to make room for Kyle, then braced an arm against the plank rail as Evelyn drove out of the sawmill. There was nothing to like about railroad life, except the money. Rebecca needs a more settled life than I could give her working for the railroad. "Well, this is about as settled as you can get," Kyle said, his gesture encompassing the sawmill, the tannery, and the grist mill as they traveled down Liberty Street toward Fredonia. The dip and sway of the wagon set their feet swinging, and Radford was struck by the memory of 4 grubby little boys sitting shoulder to shoulder on the back of their father's lumber wagon, sharing a jar of cold water and seeing who could spit the farthest after a long, dry day at the mill. A breeze rustled through the surrounding trees, carrying the fresh, green scent of summer. Radford closed his eyes, listening to the occasional burble of Canadaway Creek, the jingle and clop of Evelyn's sturdy Morgan as it pulled her wagon toward home. There was an essence of peace here that he longed to feel within himself. "Keep your eyes closed," Kyle said, "and tell me exactly where we are." Despite his melancholy, Radford smiled as he recalled the game they used to play each night on their way home from the mill. When he felt the slight leftward shift of his body, his grin widened. "We're passing the fat oak tree that sits on the inside curve of the road next to Tom and Martha Fisk's place, the one Boyd fell out of the night he spied their daughter Catherine undressing for bed." Kyle's chuckle told Radford he'd guessed correctly. Radford opened his eyes. The tree was still there, minus the branch Boyd had broken in his fall. The Fisk's house was freshly whitewashed, yet appeared smaller than Radford remembered. Maybe it was Tom and Martha's 8 kids that had made it seem so large, but Radford had always thought it dwarfed their own small home a short distance down the street. Now, it didn't look any larger than William Tucker's 2-story house that sat beyond his mother's home on the far side of a vast apple orchard. The wagon slowed, turned, and rolled to a halt in his mother's driveway. The magnolia trees his father had planted in the side yard were bigger, the bushes thicker, the house older, but it was still home. Had he been alone, he would have sat quietly, reacquainting himself with the sound of evening crickets, the smell of cut grass, the sharp rap of someone's hammer echoing across the orchard. He would have walked out back in search of that blackened spot of grass where he and his brothers had built their summer fires. He would have slipped inside the barn to see if his father's old stallion still remembered him. Instead, he dragged his gaze away from the barn and carried Rebecca to the house. Why dredge up memories from a life he could never recapture? All that mattered now was Rebecca's happiness. Kyle waved them inside, and Radford glanced at Evelyn as he stepped around her in the foyer. Though she hadn't spoken another word about the livery, her expression told him there was plenty she was holding back. "Someone's here to see you, Ma," Kyle hollered, then grinned at Radford. Drying her hands on her apron, his mother hurried into the foyer. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a bun, just the way Radford remembered, and he smiled when he saw her. All his life, his mother was rushing through chores, and it was comforting to see she hadn't lost that vitality. When she spotted Radford, she gasped, "You're home!" Tears filled her eyes, and she ran forward to hug him. "You're really home!" Radford pulled her against him with his free arm, and she wept as though he'd returned from the dead, which, in Radford's opinion, wasn't far from the truth. He hadn't seen his mother since his father's funeral. Rebecca had never seen her. His mother sniffed and lifted her head, gazing at Rebecca with eyes full of love and wonder. What a sweet, sweet baby." She smoothed her hand down Rebecca's arm and across her back, as if she needed to touch her granddaughter to believe she was real. Rebecca whimpered and burrowed in the blanket. Radford caught Evelyn's worried frown. It was obvious she thought he would step away from his mother's loving inspection, but Radford didn't move or warn her away. This was the one person he wanted Rebecca to trust, the one who would always love her, who would give Rebecca the maternal love he was incapable of providing. His mother would never abandon Rebecca like Olivia had, or abuse her like that merciless bitch, Gertrude. The sound of heavy feet in a distant room drew their attention. "Duke, Boyd, come see who's here," his mother called, her face bright with excitement. Duke's warrior-like frame rounded the corner first, and it was apparent that he'd been roused from his evening nap. His hair was pushed up on one side, and his flannel shirt gaped open, exposing a thick-muscled chest full of hair and a silver deputy's badge that dangled from his shirt pocket. Radford grinned at his brother. "Close your shirt, Deputy Grayson, and come meet your niece." Duke's eyes opened in surprise. With a laugh, he clasped Radford's hand. "It's good to see you." He glanced at Rebecca. "Now there's a fine-looking lass." "Must take after her Uncle Boyd," said their youngest brother as he emerged from the living room, tucking his shirt into his narrow waistband. Boyd's hair was freshly combed and as dark brown as Radford's. Though the youngest and much leaner in build than Duke or Kyle, he equaled them in height. Radford grinned, and his spirits lifted. "What makes you think I'd have a daughter and allow her to resemble you?" Boyd charmed them with a matching set of dimples. "Because everyone claims I look like you, dear brother, so you'd have no choice in the matter." He peeked at Rebecca, but she pulled her blanket over her head. Radford laughed with the others and slapped Boyd's shoulder, casually moving him back a step. "Better luck next time." Boyd shrugged. "I don't usually get that response from the ladies unless they're pulling the blanket over both of us." "Boy, Grayson!" He flinched at his mother's sharp reprimand, then grinned and caught her in a hug, swinging her in a circle before planting a loud kiss on her cheek. "Don't worry, Mother. You'll always be my favorite girl." Radford took Boyd's hand, giving silent thanks for the blessing of his youngest brother. Boyd's reckless charm lightened Radford's heart, and he needed that now more than ever. Even Kyle was smiling, leaning casually against the wall beside Evelyn. Maybe Radford had misjudged him. Maybe Kyle had asked him to run the livery because he really did need help. Rebecca yawned and laid her head on Radford's shoulder. "I'd better get her settled," he said, rubbing her back. His mother touched his arm. "I know William wants you and Rebecca to stay with him, but I'd rather have you here." Radford was sorry to disappoint her, but at the moment, he didn't want to share a house with Kyle. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, hoping to ease her disappointment with a little southern sugar, as the Rebs used to call it. "It'll be more convenient to stay there." "Why?" Boyd asked, his expression perplexed. "I'm going to run the livery for William." Boyd turned to Kyle. "The livery is going to be your business, not Radford's. Why not let him run the mill?" Kyle scowled. "Because that position is taken. Would you prefer to work the livery in Radford's place?" "A pretty lady in a hayloft does have its appeal," Boyd said, giving Evelyn a lusty wink that made her laugh and afforded Radford a glimpse of white teeth and a surprisingly nice smile. Boyd's expression sobered, and he turned to Radford. "Was this Kyle's idea?" By the scowl on Boyd's face, the truth would only start a war that Radford was trying to avoid. "I'm repaying a debt to an old friend," he said, answering as truthfully as possible. He would work the livery for William and let Kyle adjust to his being home. He owed him that much. "You could have said no," Evelyn told Radford on the ride home with him and his sleepy daughter. "You're the eldest. Kyle would have had to respect that." Radford turned toward her, his eyes dark and unfathomable in the twilight as they met hers. "It would have been wrong to say no to Kyle after he's worked so hard to build the business," he said. It unnerved her to see him study her as though trying to remember an old acquaintance. They didn't know each other. They may have been neighbors once, but too many years had passed for her to feel any neighborly connection with him. It didn't matter that they would become related upon her marriage to Kyle. Radford didn't feel like a brother-in-law either. He was a stranger. The fact that his smile now reached his eyes didn't lessen the sense of mystery surrounding him or the panicky feeling in her body when he looked at her. Ashamed of her disheveled appearance, she ducked her head. Heat crawled up her neck and burned her cheeks. Why couldn't he have arrived on a Sunday morning when she'd be wearing a dress for church instead of her father's old work clothes? Radford shifted beside her and settled Rebecca on his lap. "Why am I sensing that you don't want me in your livery?" His astute question added to her discomfort, and she clenched her fingers around the reins, wishing he would quit talking to her in that private voice that caressed her ears. "I'd rather work alone, that's all. You might have made some sort of compromise with Kyle if you'd been more insistent," she said, striving to calm her erratic heartbeat as she maneuvered her wagon down the dark road. "Do you really believe that?" he asked softly. She didn't. Not after seeing the fire in Kyle's eyes when Boyd had challenged him. But brothers could forgive each other anything, couldn't they? "I don't blame him for being protective of the mill," Radford said. "You shouldn't. Kyle has worked hard to build up the business and support your family." "I know that. I guess I just didn't expect him to change so much these past few years." Neither had she. But Evelyn had seen for herself what responsibility and obligation had done to a boy who'd once embraced life with a passion. Kyle had been crushed by his burdens until pieces of his laughter broke away, and he became weathered and hardened by the weight. Rebecca lifted her arms, and Radford moved her to his shoulder. She snuggled against him and hooked her small fingers in his hair. "I can't believe Kyle has had time to court you," he said, turning back to Evelyn. "When are you planning to marry?" She shied from Radford's gaze. Kyle hadn't needed to court her. She'd committed herself to him 4 years ago when his father died. At the time, she'd been Kyle's friend for years, but it was the only occasion she'd ever seen him cry. Knowing he needed someone to lean on, she had promised she'd always be there for him. Their recent engagement was simply a natural extension of their joint promise to never leave each other. "Was I prying?" he asked, breaking into her memories. She glanced at him, then turned her face to the breeze. "Of course not. Kyle and I plan to marry in November if he can finish the house that soon. I thought your mother would have written you about the wedding. I told her not to reply to my last letter because I'd be coming home shortly." He gave Evelyn a sheepish grin. "That was almost 4 weeks ago." "What took you so long to get here?" His eyes darkened, and he turned away. Rebecca wasn't ready for the trip.